In the summer of 1898, American soldiers in Cuba pried open cans of beef issued by the United States Army and encountered something that would haunt military logistics and American food policies for a generation. The meat inside was gray, stringy, and gave off an odor that one commanding general would later describe, in sworn testimony, as smelling like an embalmed dead body. Thousands of soldiers ate it anyway. They had no alternative. And within weeks, more American troops in that war would fall to contaminated rations than to enemy bullets. The can that fed them had been celebrated just decades earlier as one of the great inventions of the modern age. It was born on a battlefield and built for survival. And for most of the 19th century, it worked exactly as promised, until the industry behind it grew faster than anyone's ability to watch what went inside. The story of the tin can begin with a problem that belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte. In the 1790s, France's armies were marching across Europe and they were starving. Food spoiled faster than supply lines could move it. Limited rations forced campaigns to end before winter, and soldiers who survived the fighting often died from what they ate. Napoleon reportedly observed that an army travels on its stomach and offered 12,000 francs to anyone who could solve the problem. A Parisian confectioner named Nicolas Appert spent 15 years experimenting. By 1810, he had developed a method: seal food in airtight glass jars, cork them shut, and submerge them in boiling water. The food inside stayed edible for months. Appert didn't understand why it worked. Germ theory was half a century away, but it worked. That same year, an English merchant named Peter Durand patented an improvement. Instead of fragile glass, he used containers made of tin-coated iron. The tin can was born. It crossed the Atlantic quickly. By the 1820s, small canning operations had opened in New York. But canning remained slow, expensive, and largely confined to the military, until the American Civil War changed everything. Between 1861 and 1865, the Union Army consumed canned meat, vegetables, and condensed milk at a scale the industry had never imagined. Production surged from 5 million cans a year to 30 million. When the soldiers came home, they brought the habit with them. By the 1870s, canned food had become a fixture of the American kitchen, a symbol of progress, convenience, and the industrial future. If you've been watching this channel, you know what comes next. The moment when progress outruns the rules. Subscribe if you haven't, because every episode on this channel follows the same arc, and it always ends with the law catching up. Here's a question for the comments. When was the last time you looked at the expiration date on a can before opening it? The canning industry that boomed after the Civil War operated in a regulatory void. No federal law governed what went into a can. No inspection system verified the quality of the meat or vegetables before they were sealed inside. No label was required to list ingredients, preservatives, or the date the food had been processed. A company could pack whatever it wished, trim, gristle, leftover extract pulp, into a tin, solder it shut with lead, and ship it across the country with nothing on the outside but a brand name. The solder itself was a problem. Throughout the 19th century, the standard method for sealing a tin can was lead solder, a soft, malleable metal that was easy to work with and formed an airtight seal. It also leached into the food inside, especially acidic foods like tomatoes and fruit. The health effects of chronic lead exposure were not yet fully understood, but physicians of the era were already documenting cases of illness among people whose diets relied heavily on canned goods. And then there were the preservatives. Copper sulfate was added to canned vegetables to make them appear greener than they naturally were. Borax and salicylic acid were mixed into canned meat to prevent spoilage and mask the taste of deterioration. These chemicals extended shelf life, reduced waste, and increased profit. None of them were tested. None of them were disclosed. The reckoning came during the Spanish-American War of 1898. The conflict was brief, lasting only a few months, but the mobilization was chaotic. Secretary of War Russell Alger, focused on weapons and transport, contracted with 3 of Chicago's largest meatpacking firms to supply refrigerated and canned beef to American troops deployed in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the Army, had recommended purchasing fresh cattle locally, the Army's traditional practice. His advice was overruled. Hundreds of tons of canned and refrigerated beef were shipped instead from the mainland. What arrived was, by the accounts of the soldiers who received it, barely edible. The canned beef, made from the leftover pulp after the extraction of beef juice, contained, in the words of General Miles, no life or nourishment. When cooked, it produced an odor that soldiers compared to embalming fluid. Miles would later testify before a government commission that 337 tons of what he called embalmed beef had been shipped to troops in Puerto Rico alone. The scandal exploded into the national press. President McKinley appointed a commission led by General Grenville Dodge to investigate. The Dodge Commission traveled to nearly 20 cities, interviewed soldiers and civilians, and examined the supply chain from the Chicago packing houses to the Cuban front lines. General Miles' testimony was the most damaging. He stated under oath that the beef had been treated with chemicals to disguise its deterioration, and that the canned product was made from material so depleted of nutrients that it was unfit for consumption. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because what happened after the scandal is the part most people never hear about. What product do you have in your pantry right now that you've never checked the date on? Tell us in the comments. The meat packers denied wrongdoing. The Dodge Commission officially exonerated them, concluding that the confirmed cases of illness were due to mishandling rather than deliberate adulteration, but the controversy refused to die. A second investigation, a military tribunal that became known remarkably as the Beef Court, was convened. Its conclusions were similarly cautious, but the political damage was done. Secretary of War Alger, under sustained public criticism, was forced to resign. The embalmed beef scandal did not produce an immediate law. What it produced was something harder to quantify, but ultimately more consequential. It planted in the minds of the American public and their elected officials the understanding that the food supply could not police itself. When, 8 years later, the pressure from multiple scandals converged, the revelations about the meatpacking industry, the documented evidence from government chemists, the mounting toll of chemical preservatives on public health, the embalmed beef affair was part of the foundation. On June 30, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Meat Inspection Act into law. Roosevelt had personal reasons to support it. In 1898, he had been a colonel in Cuba, leading the Rough Riders, eating the same rations the soldiers ate. He had witnessed what the canned beef did to his men. The law he signed required federal inspection of all meat sold in interstate commerce. It mandated sanitary conditions in processing plants. It established for the first time a permanent system of government oversight over the industry that filled the cans. The tin can did not disappear. It remains one of the most efficient and widely used methods of food preservation ever devised. A direct descendant of Nicholas Apper's glass jars and Peter Durand's tin plate cylinders, refined over 2 centuries, still doing exactly what Napoleon needed it to do. What changed was what happened before the lid went on. The next time you pick up a can of food, any brand, look at the top. Find the stamped date. Find the small marks that indicate the batch, the plant, the inspection. That information exists because for most of the 19th century, it didn't. The industry sealed whatever it wished inside a tin, soldered it shut, and sent it to market, to soldiers, to families, to anyone who trusted the label on the outside. The stamp doesn't explain itself. It doesn't describe the soldiers in Cuba who opened their rations and recoiled. It doesn't mention the general who testified about embalmed beef, or the Secretary of War who lost his job, or the colonel who became president and signed the law that changed everything. It simply marks the can as inspected, because someone, more than a century ago, proved what could happen when nobody checked.